Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian McGraw. I am a professor in the Politics and International Relations Department and director of the Certificate in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, of which this is a part of our program sponsored by the Wheaton Center on Faith, Politics, and Economics. First thing, let me say a big thanks to Heidi Leffler, who coordinates sort of the center and all of her work in putting this together and our sort of colloquium we had this afternoon. Heidi does amazing work, and if you ever want to know somebody who's just great, please stop into this second floor of MSC. Tonight, we are sort of fortunate to have a lecture by Professor Brad Wilcox. I've known Brad, we were talking about this earlier, since 1999, which makes us both feel just a little bit too old, I think. Brad is a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. He is also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and make sure I get this right, and I take my glasses off because I am middle-aged now, senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. He writes extensively for both academic and public journals on issues of marriage and family, and he's currently finishing a book on marriage for HarperCollins. So you have up here a Slido. That's really, we're going to sort of take questions. Professor Wilcox will give his talk, and then I'll come up and sort of pitch questions from Slido to him for the remainder of the evening. So please welcome Professor Brad Wilcox.
Thanks, Brian and Heidi, for organizing tonight, and thanks to the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. So on a warm spring day in 2000, a kind of who's who audience of lawmakers, lobbyists, Hill staffers, and academics gathered on Think Tank Row in Washington, D.C. to hear President Bill Clinton deliver a ringing endorsement of the China trade bill. The president gave a typically Clintonian, by which I mean effusive and extravagant, endorsement of the bill, full of promises about the good that would come from normalizing trade with China. Free trade with China would advance economic freedom, have a profound impact on human rights and political liberty in China, and most importantly for his domestic audience, foster a future of greater prosperity for the American people. Virtually all of the smart people of the time, from the editors of the Wall Street Journal to the fellows of the think tanks lining Massachusetts Avenue, where Clinton had been giving this speech, bought the president's promises. So too did senior politicians on both sides of the aisle, including then Senator Joe Biden. But in retrospect, Clinton's promises ring hollow. There was no flowering of freedom in China, political, religious, or technological. And this promise of a future of greater prosperity for the American people, too, I think fell flat in some important ways. Now, to be clear, there is no question that expanded trade with China enriched many of the kinds of elites that were assembled before Clinton on that spring day in Washington. It also brought countless cheap goods, from sneakers, we can think of Nike here, to smartphones, we can think of Apple here, to our shores. But the idea that a dramatic expansion in free trade with China brought greater prosperity for the American people would come as a rude surprise to millions of Americans across the Midwest and the Southeast of this nation. And that's because the China trade deal struck by Clinton, Biden, and the Washington establishment led to what's been called the China trade shock. According to the economist from MIT, David Autor, and his colleagues, more than 2 million Americans were thrown out of work from this China trade shock. The toll on these workers and their families was devastating. He found the shock had, quote, particularly negative impacts on the labor market prospects of men, unquote, eliminating their jobs and, quote, diminishing their relative earnings, unquote. So in plain language, what Autor's work suggests is that millions of men lost ground as providers. And what we know sociologically is that men who are not stably employed in decent paying jobs are less attractive as potential husbands and more likely to land in divorce court. So we saw that the regions that were hit hard by the China trade shock saw family instability surge. So what happened here then, right, is that more trade with China meant less marriage, fewer kids, and a dwindling prospect of attaining the American dream for millions of working and middle-class families across America. So this is kind of but one example of the ways in which our Republican and Democratic ruling class has too often failed American families. And in this case, elite blindness to the welfare of working class men on the question of trade with China stemmed in part from a kind of blind faith in what Orrin Cass has called a kind of free market fundamentalism. Now, while it's true, of course, that free trade and market liberalization lead to economic growth, many on the right and in the center could not see at the time the sort of downside to free trade in this context. They had, quote, too much faith in a laissez-faire ideology that sees labor markets as automatically self-correcting and did not anticipate the terrible toll that trade with China would exact on scores of working class families across the United States. This free market fundamentalism is just but one example of the ways in which our ruling class, both Republican and Democrat, in both the public and private sectors, has made decisions that have eviscerated the economic and social foundations of family life for too many working and middle-class Americans. In recent decades, government and corporate leaders have made choices on trade and technology, education, and welfare that often benefited their economic or social standing, but undercut ordinary American families. And too often, it's been precisely the American families that can least afford to pay this price, that have paid the price for our elites' bad decisions. Now, when it comes to the family in particular, there are a range of ways that this dynamic has played out, as the next couple of slides will indicate. We can think about how marriage in this country has been in retreat since the 1970s. We're kind of now at the lowest marriage rate that we've ever had historically, with about 1 in 2 Americans being married. And this retreat has kind of happened under, of course, both Republican and Democratic administrations, under both, for instance, Reagan and Clinton on this particular outcome. We can think also more recently about the ways in which fertility in this country has been falling, really falling since 2009 under both Trump and the Obama administrations, to the point now where we're at the lowest total fertility rate. That's 1.64 babies per woman on average, our lowest rate ever in American history. So kind of another indicator of the way in which the family is, in some important respects, floundering. And then when it comes to kind of family stability, I think one of the most compelling and important and worrisome statistics is that about 1 in 2 kids in America today will grow up apart from kind of the safety and security of being raised by their own 2 married parents, as this slide here indicates for us tonight. Now, it's also, again, important to think about the ways in which kind of the family changes of the last half century have not affected all Americans in a kind of equal manner. We can see here in this next slide that basically upper middle class and upper class Americans in the top 2 quintiles, for instance, in this figure, have in important ways kind of maintained the sort of married family as their model. About 90% of kids in those 2 quintiles still managing to live in married families. By contrast, there's been a pretty dramatic erosion in married parent families in the middle and the working class, as this figure here indicates from 2 Brookings scholars. So what I'm suggesting tonight then is that our ruling class has let the educational, the economic, and the cultural foundations of strong and stable families crumble in all too many communities, particularly middle and working class communities in more recent decades. And what's going on here in part is that we have failed our society and failed our families in kind of 3 different areas that I'm going to kind of go through now in this next section of my lecture. So the first area is kind of related to sort of men and work. And the reality now is that too many men in our country are not stably employed. The percent of men in their prime working years, ages 25 to 54, who are not working full-time has more than doubled from 8% in 1970 to about 1 in 5 today. As my AEI colleague Nicholas Eberstedt has noted in his book, Men Out of Work, this has been particularly salient, these trends have been particularly salient for men who don't have a college degree, which is also the majority of American men. So why are so many men, as you can kind of see again in these figures to my right and to my left, not in the labor force in America today? What's sort of going on with that? Well, I think part of the problem here is that what I call kind of big education, by which I mean our schools, our colleges and universities, are often failing to do sort of their best work with boys and men. They're doing a kind of notoriously bad job in some respects of educating males. The pedagogy, the substance, and ethos that's found in too many of our schools is kind of fueling a widening gap between male and female performance on the educational front. So we can see, for instance, that boys are about twice as likely to be expelled from school, and that there's a growing gap. It's actually bigger now than even this gap that I have up here on the slide. It's about 15% now of a gender gap in American colleges. So Thomas Mortensen, a senior scholar at the Pell Institute for the Study of Opportunity in Higher Education, has said this. He says, quote, "Men are falling behind remarkably fast, in this sort of educational arena." And what's also, I think, striking here is when you kind of look at what the government is doing in higher education, they're spending about 79 times as much money on colleges and universities compared to like vocational education and apprenticeship training, even though only a minority of adults are graduating from colleges and universities, and there's this kind of, again, growing gender gap there as well. There's also a way, I think, in which sort of the structure of government benefits and sort of the impact that big tech is having on the life of adolescent males and young men is implicated in these kinds of trends. So what we're seeing today is that big government is kind of rewarding idleness and penalizing work for too many young and middle-aged men. One reason the share of men who are not working full-time has more than doubled since 1970 is that growing numbers of them are living off government assistance, especially Social Security, disability insurance, SSDI. Of course, many of these men have legitimate mental or medical problems that keep them away from work. But the share of prime-age men on disability has surged even as the physical conditions of work have gotten easier in America, which suggests that some men on assistance do not need it. What's also frustrating here is the system is often set up so that going back to full-time work is often a worse deal financially than just remaining on disability and collecting a government check. This dynamic of kind of men being disconnected from work is also, I think, augmented by the ways in which big tech is pushing increasingly alluring electronic opiates from Xbox to OnlyFans that distract adolescent and young adult males from engaging both in school and in work to their fullest. The Princeton economist Mark Aguirre and his team found that recreational computer time surged 60% for young men ages 21 to 30 from 2004 to 2017, and that this increase accounted for almost half of the decline in work for men in this age group. So it's kind of one example of how this dynamic is affecting men's connection to work. And of course, I think with the arrival of the metaverse, that's now upon us, this kind of dynamic, with guys being kind of distracted by these electronic opiates is only going to become more salient for us as a society. So again, the concern here, right, when it comes to sort of men and work, is that men who are not employed in decent paying, stable jobs are much less likely to get married, and they're much more likely to end up in divorce court. So this is kind of a big concern that we have so many men who are not connected to full-time work in this day and in this moment. A second concern that I think has been not sufficiently addressed by our political class is the way in which the cost of living in many places across America is spiraling upwards for too many working and middle-class families, outpacing their ability to afford key aspects of family life. Now, sure, it's true that we have more cheap stuff, TVs beyond our wildest imagination compared to like when I was growing up in the 70s, but on many major ticket items, too many of our families are reporting that these big ticket items are out of reach. This came through with an IFS focus group, an Institute for Family Studies focus group that was conducted actually in Ohio and in Georgia and in Texas as well. So 3 different sets of focus groups. So in speaking with working class Americans in these 3 places, we heard comments like this. So this is an Ohio mother, a white woman in her 50s saying this. It's been so much harder to maintain a home and home life without having 2 incomes to complete everything, she said. Financially, it's become more difficult for families. Another palpable frustration among working class Americans that we spoke with is that they feel like poor people with only a tenuous connection to work are receiving government benefits that give them a standard of living that's almost as good as their own. Quote, "It's like we are damned if we do, damned if we don't. If we work, we don't have any type of resources like the poor get from the government," as one African American Atlanta mom told our group. And this view was shared by a married middle-class mother in Southern Ohio who said, quote, "I think the middle class is struggling more than the lower class because the lower class has so many more opportunities for programs than the working or middle class," unquote. Now, in some important respects, they're not wrong. So we see in this figure, also from some Brookings scholars, again, Richard Reeves and Bell Sawhill, that sort of the growth in income over time has been much more stagnant for kind of the middle and working class than for the rich and the poor. They, quote, "experienced much slower income growth," talking about the middle class, "than both the affluent, who have seen rising wages, and the poor, who have been helped by an expanded safety net," according to Richard Reeves, again, and Bell Sawhill at Brookings. So over the last 40 years here, the point is that middle-income households have seen their income rise by only about half of the amount that poor and affluent Americans have seen their income rise. And the irony here is that big government has driven up the prices of many of the goods most challenging for families in the middle to afford, goods like childcare, education, and housing. Take higher education and housing, for instance. College costs have spiraled upward partly because the federal government now pumps billions of dollars into subsidies and loans to higher ed. And colleges have responded to expansions of financial aid by increasing tuition, as one study recently noted. Housing costs are also outpacing inflation, especially in big metro areas from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. to the Chicago area, because onerous environmental regulations and local zoning regulations make it too expensive to build new homes cheaply in many communities. So too many working and middle-class families are struggling to juggle the financial and the time demands of having 2 full-time workers and the responsibility of raising the next generation. I think these costs are also implicated, too, in people's decisions to have fewer kids today as well. The third thing that I want to mention is about the way in which government policy is penalizing marriage. And I'll begin by just giving you a kind of a quick story from Virginia, where I've been doing some interviews. So Mark and Lisa Payne could have stepped out of a Norman Rockwell portrait. This attractive working class couple lives in a modest country home in Central Virginia with their 2 beautiful blonde daughters who are 4 and 6 years old. He works as a plumber for an HVAC company based in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and she's a stay-at-home mother. Their lives are traditional in many respects, but they're decidedly non-traditional in one respect. They're not married. When I asked him about this incongruity, Mark said, quote, "You know, we sat down at the kitchen table and we ran the numbers for Medicaid, and it didn't add up." So what he was basically telling me was that because his income is close to $40,000, if they had gotten married and reported their joint income, they would not have been eligible for Medicaid, which covers medical insurance both for Lisa and for their 2 daughters. So this kind of is one example of the way in which public policy can end up penalizing marriage. And their experience is, also paralleled in other conversations that my colleagues have had. So a black mother in Atlanta, as part of our focus group, said, quote, "Yes, I chose not to marry," adding, "I get a lot of assistance from my children for myself. So if I did marry or put any other type of income in, I would not qualify for anything from the government." So these are kind of examples of the way in which public policy can end up penalizing marriage. And these penalties today actually end up falling hardest on families with total incomes of between about $30,000 and $85,000, but particularly more the $30,000 to $50,000 bracket. And studies suggest that they can lose between 10 and 30% of their household income if they go ahead and marry and report that income with respect to kind of benefits like Medicaid or child care subsidies or the earned income tax credit. And there are also studies indicating that these penalties are linked to less marriage. So one study finds that moms who are facing an earned income tax penalty were almost 3 percentage points less likely to marry. And another recent survey found that about 1 in 2 of unmarried Americans whose income was below the median said that they were not getting married because they would lose their government benefits. And there's a kind of a partisan, or I should say a political story here that is that in 1997, Congress took up some of the marriage penalties facing American families, but only the ones facing affluent Americans. They addressed many marriage penalties embedded in income taxes for the upper half of the income distribution. But they failed to tackle the penalties from programs used by working class families. And so in a major, in my view, dereliction of duty, lawmakers stopped giving relief to precisely the group that has seen the greatest increase in family instability rise over the last 4 decades. So these are kind of 3 examples of the ways in which I think our ruling class has not paid sufficient attention to some issues that impinge on our American families. Now what I'm going to do is kind of just talk briefly about how I think both the Republicans and the Democrats have in distinct ways kind of failed American families. When it comes to Republicans, I would have to begin by acknowledging that they often talk a good game on family life. So again, to be sure, when it comes to addressing the family's fortunes, there's no doubt that many Republicans have spoken over and over again about family issues. So from Vice President Dan Quayle's Murphy Brown speech to Senator Rick Santorum's book on families, again, there's no question the Republicans have led the way in voicing concerns about American family life. But when it comes to kind of public policies that would help families, they've been often MIA, missing in action. And the 2017 debate over the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is illustrative of this dynamic. Senators Mike Lee and Marco Rubio had introduced an amendment that would have made the child tax credit apply to both income and payroll taxes, thereby putting real money in the pockets of millions of working and middle-class families. Unfortunately, many of their colleagues, Republican colleagues in the Senate, were so focused on delivering a big tax cut for corporate America that they could not bring themselves to shave off 0.98% of the corporate tax cut to deliver a more generous child benefit to working and middle-class families across the country. So for too many Republicans in this case, big business or the free market kind of took precedence over the welfare of ordinary families. We see this, I think, today with one of the most prominent Republican voices and a likely 2024 presidential candidate. And that, of course, is the former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley up here on my right and my left. She's a talented, engaging, and appealing politician. She's a natural at politics. Unfortunately, her approach to family policy is, from my perspective, unoriginal and off base, taken right out of the 1980s Republican playbook, with no consideration for the challenges facing families in the 21st century. In an article on family policy for National Review, for instance, all she could do was lash out at the child tax credit, describing it as a kind of welfare policy. And what Haley, I think, failed to acknowledge here is that unlike old-style welfare, a monthly child benefit does not penalize work and marriage for the poor and working class and helps a wide range of American families with the challenges of affording a family in the 21st century. In all of this, Haley also displayed no recognition that the challenges we face today are different than the ones of the last century. No recognition that too many men are idle or presumed unnecessary in America today. No recognition that marriage and fertility have fallen to record lows as families struggle to keep up with the cost of living. And no recognition that her party has failed to shore up the American family, often in any way beyond mere lip service. So in the face of new, fundamental challenges confronting families, the Republican Party's response has too often been, in a sense, let them eat tax cuts as we throw in a little talk of family values at election time. This kind of Nikki Haleyism, however, is now besides the point. It's time for politicians to take bolder actions to revive the fortunes of the family in America. Now, on this score, you might think, well, isn't it the case the Democrats have been offering a variety of bold actions in recent years? And there's no question, I think, that the Democrats' family agenda in 221 was in many respects quite bold. So in a speech at Tidewater Community College, President Joe Biden said that his American Families Plan represented, quote, a once-in-a-generation investment in our families, in our children, that addresses what people care most about and most need. But when you look at the details of many of the Democratic policies on offer, what you see is what I would call is a kind of statism and a kind of workism. So by statism, what I mean is kind of like there's a temptation, I think, to take functions and authority that have classically been given over to the family and to pass them over to the state. Okay, so we kind of give more and more of the family's functions to Uncle Sam and to the local states and to local governments. So that's kind of what I mean by statism. When it comes to workism, I think there's kind of an implicit sense that work is where all the action is, that work is kind of the source and summit of our lives, and that the sort of ideal family model for American parents is one where both parents are working, perhaps even working full-time. And this kind of came through in the most recent policy discussions when Susan Rice, who's the head of the President's Domestic Policy Council, said this. She said, quote, "We want parents to be in the workforce, especially mothers." Okay, so there's kind of no bones about kind of this idea that, again, sort of the best model is one where both parents are in the workplace. And there's a kind of, implicit or explicit devaluation of the work that parents, are doing in the home caring for their kids. So to be more concrete here, now I think it is the case that one feature of Biden's plan last year that I was excited about was his push to expand the child tax credit and to pay it out on a monthly basis, thereby helping millions of American families with the financial challenges of raising kids today. But on other fronts, I was disappointed. So I was disappointed that his earned income tax credit plan would have penalized marriage. I was disappointed that his push for universal pre-K would have, basically, again, privileged a more statist approach to the care of preschool children. And then I think the most egregious part of his plan was his push to spend more than $200 billion on efforts to subsidize daycare for middle-income and lower-income kids, therefore basically creating a powerful policy incentive in favor of just one way of caring for our youngest children, using care outside of the home. And there was, in this case, kind of no recognition on the part of the Biden administration that most American parents prefer that their young kids are cared for by family members. This came through when I was speaking to Andrea Nunez, a 25-year-old mother in St. Petersburg, Florida, who relies on her family to take care of her toddler. She said this, quote, "Both grandmas lived nearby and took turns caring for our daughter," she said to me. Quote, "It's great having someone you trust, knowing that she is going to be in good hands," talking about her, her mother-in-law, and her daughter. Nunez preferred family care to daycare because, quote, "when they're a baby, it's harder to trust a child care worker because they have other kids they're looking after, not just ours. But being with the grandparent, they'll get the attention, love, and care that a baby needs, unquote. And Nunez is no outlier. As we found in our survey with YouGov, a majority of parents say they prefer to have their kids at home, either cared for by parents or a family member, as, again, the figures here to my left and right indicate. So this is kind of an example of the way in which the Democratic agenda, which is in this way more statist and workist, doesn't really dovetail with what most American parents would like. So is there a better way here, as I wrap things up tonight, when it comes to family policy? And I think there is. So I think that reviving the fortunes of the American family depends upon strengthening the educational, the economic, and the cultural foundations of marriage and family life in America. We must go towards policies that are what I would call familist. And by familism, I mean the idea that men and women should prioritize the needs of their family over their own individual desires. That we are working towards a world where parents have the money and the time they need to raise strong families. A world where more of the classical functions of family life, from eating to caring for young children, take place in the home rather than outside of it. This means, among other things, that we'd be aiming for a world, as Blake Masters has said, he's a candidate for the Senate in Arizona, a world where in America you should be able to raise a family on one single income. Now, obviously, kind of government can only do so much to kind of advance a familistic agenda, but there is a role for family public policy here when it comes to reviving the fortunes of the American family. And here I'm going to offer 5 ideas for policies that would strengthen and stabilize marriage and family life here in the U.S. So the first idea when it comes to education is to defund college and refund vocational education. And so what I'm suggesting here is that we need to really wrap our heads around this fact that a clear majority of young adults today, and it was a surprise to many of my students at UVA, it's probably a surprise to some of you here at Wheaton, but a clear majority of young adults, particularly young men, still do not get college degrees. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of federal and state money for higher education goes to colleges and universities. So do a rebalancing. We're going to be spending more money on vocational education and apprenticeship training, kind of like in the spirit of a country like Germany or Japan here. And the number I'm kind of offering here is that we kind of spend at least 1/3 of federal and state monies for higher ed on vocational education and apprenticeship training. And we have seen evidence, for instance, from evaluations of career academies that do provide vocational education to high school students. They've boosted both the earnings and the marriage prospects for less advantaged young men across America. So we need kind of more of that in the educational sector. The second idea is thinking about ways to make work pay even more for lower income adults. So thinking about a wage subsidy, like for instance Orrin Cass and Bell Sawhill have talked about. So one idea here would be to sort of target an hourly wage that's close to the median wage in the nation or in different regions, and then to have the federal government subsidize the difference between that wage and the market wage for lower income workers. And this would kind of give them both more money to potentially bring home to families. It might make work more appealing for young men who've kind of, as I said before, withdrawn from the labor force, and basically be one more way of kind of stabilizing financially lower income families across the country. A third idea is to eliminate marriage penalties, recognizing here that programs from Medicaid to child care often penalize marriage. So we could do this, for instance, by doubling the threshold for married families when it comes to our means-tested policies. And because we might be concerned about the sort of fiscal impact of that, we could kind of limit this policy to families with kids under the age of 5, when people kind of are forming their families, kind of getting them off on a stronger start, one where they're not worrying about any kind of fiscal consequences, downsides to getting married. And of course, the idea here is that government should not be in the business of discouraging marriage for ordinary Americans. The fourth idea is about school choice. Right now, obviously, practically, our educational system reserves school choice largely for the rich. Better off families can move to neighborhoods with the best public schools, or they can enroll their children in private schools when they're not happy with their public options. We see this pattern even among countless liberal politicians, from Senator Elizabeth Warren to California Governor Gavin Newsom, who on the one hand profess support for public schools, and on the other hand, pay for their own children to attend private schools. Well, I think all Americans, kind of regardless of their income, should have the opportunity to send their kids to private schools, in part because my colleagues and I have done research indicating that kids who attend such schools, particularly religious schools, are more likely to go on later in life to form strong and stable families. So with that kind of, in mind, what I would suggest is that we use both federal and state money to give families ESAs worth about $6,000 for each child that would allow them to exercise greater choice when it comes to how they educate the next generation. And the final thing is to promote what's been called the success sequence. And the idea here is that too many of our young adults are uncertain about how best to navigate the transition into adulthood, especially when it comes to forming a family. I was talking to my students at UVA just a few days ago, asking them if they'd encountered any message about marriage in their high schools. And to a student, they said no, they hadn't encountered anything about marriage in high school. So, I think that the challenge facing us is that we're not kind of giving our young adults, either in our schools, obviously, or in the pop culture, a kind of accurate, a message or a compelling message about marriage and family life. And so the success sequence is this idea, it's drawn from Bell Sawhill and Ron Haskins at Brookings, that if you have at least a high school degree first, then if you work full-time in your 20s, and then you marry before having kids, your odds of being poor are just about 3%, as young adults. And of course, your odds of forging a sort of relatively strong and stable marriage and family life are that much higher. And that we could kind of build a campaign around this sequence that would describe a series of crucial life decisions, to young adults in ways that would kind of give them some constructive guidance as they think about young adulthood. And sort of the model here, right, would be kind of campaigns against smoking and teenage pregnancy, which have kind of taught us that sustained efforts to change behavior can work. And this campaign, I think, would have to rely on educational, civic, media, pop cultural, and religious institutions to kind of get this message across to a wide audience. And the hope here is that it would be as successful as our campaign to reduce teen pregnancy, which seems to have played a role in driving down teen pregnancy more than 65% since the 1990s. So a familist policy agenda would reject the blind faith of the right in the market and the left in the state. It would seek to renew the educational, the economic, and the cultural foundations of family life for our day. And it would kind of recognize as well that we need to reinforce parents' ability to invest time and money in their kids and also to invest in one another. So it would be kind of aiming to strengthen our two most fundamental family bonds. That's the pair bond between parents and the parent-child bond as well. So the alternative to doing what I've suggested tonight, or taking steps like the ones that I've suggested tonight, I think would be to accept a world where the United States devolves into an even more separate and unequal family regime than it already is, where strong and stable families are the preserve of the educated, the affluent, and the religious, and everyone else is consigned to increasingly unstable, unhappy, and unworkable families, or even more so, I think today, no family at all. I think we can all agree tonight that this alternative is unacceptable and un-American. And that is why our ruling class needs to do much, much better when it comes to supporting American families. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Just microphone on, great. So if you can go back to the sort of the original Slido slide so that people have the number in case you didn't get it at first. I have a bunch of questions here for you, and so I'm going to have to kind of juggle looking at questions and asking you as well. But I suppose that we can start off by asking. You focused and you sort of framed the talk framed your talk in terms of a kind of a China shock and the kind of the resulting economic and cultural effects on marriage and family that came from that. So the first thing is to ask, so how would you rate or rank the kind of the relative impact of these kind of economic changes versus some of the sort of the cultural changes, obviously in sexual norms, family sort of priorities and so on, that has certainly sort of shifted in American life at least since the 1950s, I would say.
Great question. I certainly think the conservatives have been much more concerned about culture and cultural changes when it comes to sort of understanding our moment family-wise than progressives. And I would certainly, acknowledge and affirm the importance of sort of culture in playing a central role in where we sort of sit today. And the example that I would give is that we kind of think about, the Great Depression in the 1930s. I think we all recognize that there was a huge economic shock to our country, our society, our nation. And yet in the midst of the 1930s, there was no big increase in divorce. There was no big increase in single parenthood, no big increase in family instability. So it kind of suggests to us that kind of in different cultural and different civic context, family life can, I'm not saying it was easy, obviously, for families back then, but there was a way in which, our culture and our civil society helped Americans navigate economic difficulty more successfully. So that's just my way of saying I think culture is certainly a big role, or has played a big role in our current family predicaments. But I'm also suggesting tonight that, I think particularly conservatives need to think more deeply about the way in which economics has also had a hand in recent family change as well. And as we kind of go forward, we need to think about supporting families in a number of ways, not just kind of trying to push a certain kind of cultural shift.
So, great. So there's a couple questions I'm going to combine and meld them together on here. I wonder if you would sort of talk a little bit about how you think your proposals sort of interact with the question of sort of markets. Because certainly one of the things that sort of seems to be true over the last couple of decades is that globalization, liberalization of markets has reduced the prices of many goods. And you sort of point out that there are ways in which public subsidies, regulations, and such sort of increase the prices of certain kinds of goods. So I'm just curious to know sort of how you think about your proposals sort of vis-a-vis markets more broadly.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to sort of markets, I think there obviously is an important place for markets in sort of governing our economic life. And as my comments suggest, when it comes to things like housing and college and even childcare, I think we haven't done enough, sort of a good enough job of kind of letting the markets have, in some ways, a stronger hand in all this. At the same time, I think we have to recognize there's a kind of a political economy out there that's there, and which should be kind of. We need to realize that there's a way in which the state has a role to play in superintending the market and superintending economic life, and that I would say it's sort of one of its primary concerns is making sure that the labor force is functioning in a healthy way, because that's so foundational to the health of our families in part. And so, one of the points that Orrin Cass has made is that, in sort of critiquing the right and Republicans, of which I'm more on that side, is that there's been kind of this fixation on, sort of growth and not kind of an adequate appreciation of the importance of making sure that enough, people are employed. And that goes to my first comments about sort of men's labor force patterns in recent decades. So what I'm saying is I think the political economy piece should be focused much more on making sure that our economy is doing a good job of employing people, and then also of making sure that ordinary middle-class Americans can afford a decent way of life as well.
So maybe to kind of press a little bit and sort of follow up on that a little bit. I mean, your title is about how the kind of the political class, and sort of use that term again and again, sort of has kind of failed American families, and yet it seems like you want to kind of give that same political class a lot more tools and money, as it were, to do different things in. I take it sort of lurking behind the argument is an argument that says that elite Americans, I don't know, top 20% of the income distribution, I think I can think of a book that does this, have basically sort of rearranged opportunities in America to sort of benefit themselves, whether this is zoning laws, education policy, taxes, so on and so forth. Right. How plausible do you think sort of getting this kind of agenda a serious hearing is there, and how plausible is it actually put into place as opposed to just giving more resources? I mean, if your kind of analysis is right, the background analysis is right, why not just think that this political class will simply rearrange things, tweak little bits and pieces? Think of again the sort of the story you told about the tax cut bill where it only erased marriage penalties for the top half. Why not think that that's going to just be repeated?
Well, I think it's a very real possibility, but I think the challenge is to articulate both the problem with what's happening in terms of how policies are not necessarily serving ordinary families well enough, and then to have effective political leaders raise these issues in a public fashion and then move forward with an agenda that's more attentive to the needs of working middle class families. Mm-hmm. And I think the problem is we've been in a and again, this is particularly for conservatives and Republicans, we've been in a world where Republicans have not really, I think, grappled with the way in which, public policy has sort of overlooked the welfare of, ordinary middle class and working families. And as their coalition shifts, there's, I think, the possibility that they might become more attentive, mm-hmm. To the needs of or more ordinary working class families rather than the sort of top 20% or the top 30%.
So a couple of questions. I'm going to combine a couple of these as well. Someone notes that U.S. has something like $29 trillion in public debt. Yes, college students, you'll be sort of paying on that. So what do you take to be a kind of a ballpark figure? I mean, if Professor Wilcox was brought in and got to write the legislation and it passed as he wanted, what's sort of the ballpark figure for cost for that? And what, I mean, does it worry you? Does that worry you, given sort of our already sort of relatively high levels of public debt?
Yeah, there's a bunch of economists sitting up here in the front of the auditorium, and I would probably defer more to them on talking about how do we deal with public debt going forward. So, I mean, I am concerned about, the level of debt that we're incurring right now, and I certainly would also, and this makes me in some ways less conservative, be in favor of trying to raise taxes on both more affluent Americans and companies to address and rein in this debt. That's sort of how I think about that issue.
All right, sorry. This is where I'm going to fall behind my strategy here. So I guess one question I would have, and somebody brought this up, and I can't quite find the question right now, is to what degree do you think, given these certain kinds of public policy changes, how much would you estimate that you actually rebuild sort of marriage and stable families? I mean, given that the culture has shifted,
sure.
Given that you have now, I take it, sort of generations of of people for whom marriage is not really a part of the kind of their sense of like what's normal. How do you does it really rebuild in that way?
Yeah, so there's a sort of a classic sociological piece talking about sort of the duality of structure. And the point that this theorist was making is that, societies depend on both culture and social structure. But to answer your point, what I'm thinking here is that we need to be thinking about this in terms of both economic changes and also cultural changes. And so if we were to kind of pass the perfect raft of policies, minus my last recommendation here, that would only kind of move the dial a little bit in the right direction, Brian. Yeah. But I think if we were to couple that policy shift with a major cultural change, that would give us, I think, greater confidence of turning a corner. Now, I think one other, and this is a much more provocative, hypothetical point that I would make right now, but one of the things we've seen is that since COVID, I think progressives and secular Americans have been much more cautious in their approach to COVID, and that's obviously, saved a lot of lives. But I think in terms of coming out of COVID or going forward as COVID is endemic, that caution and that sort of aversion to risk, a kind of hesitation about embracing life to the fullest, has implications for a variety of different things, including their willingness to get married and have children, which are kind of risky things, particularly today. And so we did a survey in September with YouGov and found that there's just a much greater kind of movement away from marriage and a movement away from childbearing among both Democrats and secular Americans. So one possibility here too is there's a kind of way in which if the culture continues to move in ways such that progressives and secularists are more risk averse, more kind of safetyist in their orientation to life, and also, much more kind of progressive in their ideas about gender and sex and family life, that might kind of push them away from marriage and push them away from childbearing in much greater numbers than has been the case for the last 40 years. And so there'd be kind of a way in which folks who are more conservative and more religious would have a kind of longer-term demographic advantage because their cultural orientation was more kind of family-friendly, practically and otherwise. So that, that's a much more speculative point, and I've only seen kind of one data point on this, idea. But if we see the sort of same pattern showing up again, say in surveys later this year, where there's been a gap between Democrats and Republicans, between religious and secular Americans on marriage and fertility from the 70s to the present in the GSS. But that gap could become much larger given some current dynamics. And if that's the case, that might, relate to this sort of question of policy and culture moving in certain directions.
I think if I remember, I think I saw a poll in the last couple of weeks that suggested that among all categories of Americans, there was a kind of some sort of move away from marriage, maybe from children as well. That it did seem to cross some of those demographic lines. So one question that just kind of follow up on that, and this is sort of an interesting question, is so as I recall it, Lord Keynes sort of had this prediction in the 1930s that we would be a lot wealthier, and that we would use that wealth largely to buy leisure, right? I think he predicted something like a 15 per hour work week, which we don't have. And so instead we bought stuff, bigger houses, cars, vacations, to the degree those of us who have that sort of wealth. Part of, I take it you have this sort of on one of the slides, as part of the kind of the policy proposal is to make it possible for people to live reasonably comfortably on one salary. Right. What do you think the expectations are that people would actually do that versus sort of take the sort of extra subsidies and just use it to buy,
a nicer truck,
more stuff? Yeah, nicer truck, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I certainly think that, and my colleague Scott Winship at AEI is, skeptical of some of my ideas on this front. And I think that's sort of his take is that, sort of what Americans expect when it comes to their homes and their vehicles today, sort of keep kind of, increasing. And so that's from his perspective, the big challenge facing middle working class families, more so than the kinds of things that I've mentioned tonight. I think, again, we're talking about sort of a cultural question in part here, right? And can we get Americans to realize that, when it comes to sort of like the meaning of your life, when it comes to your sort of long-term happiness, when it comes to sort of your sense of solidarity, that your education, your job, your bank account do not compare to your family members and your friendships, that we are social animals, and that I think too many Americans have assumed that, and we see this now actually in data from Pew recently, that, most Americans think that money and work are more likely to bring them fulfillment than marriage and family life. That's empirically wrong. I can show them data from the GSS, but that's sort of the new view. So again, there's going to have to be some kind of cultural shifts to, I think, get Americans to appreciate more profoundly how much family and friends, communities, including religious ones, matter more than education, work, and bank accounts.
Well, I think that's a pretty good point to sort of end things. There are many questions that I did not ask. I think you'll just sit here for a bit and talk to people as they come up. So if you have any questions that you kind of really want to get that answer to, feel free to come up and Dr. Wilcox. But please join me in thanking Dr. Wilcox for a provocative and interesting lecture. Thank you. Thanks all and have a great night.